Part 3. The Peninsular War. Napoleon's Spanish Ulcer. In the autumn of 1807, the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte dominated Europe. He had humiliated Austria and Prussia and signed a treaty with Russia. Of the major powers, only Britain still defied him, safe behind the strength of its navy. Napoleon had ordered all territories controlled by France or its allies to stop trading with Britain. The so-called Continental System, or blockade, designed to wreck Britain's economy and force its government to sue for peace. But neutral Portugal continued to trade with its historic ally, Britain. So Napoleon sent an army under General Junot to occupy the country and force it into the system. The invasion was supported by France's ally, Spain, though privately, Napoleon held the Spanish rulers in contempt. The Bourbon royal family was decadent and corrupt. The king and the crown prince hated each other, while the country was effectively run by its chief minister, Manuel Godoy, who was the queen's lover. Spain, Napoleon concluded, was backward, militarily weak, and incompetently governed, and he devised a plan to seize control of the country himself. Spaniards! After a long agony, your nation was on the point of perishing. I have seen your sufferings, and I bring you a remedy. Proclamation of Emperor Napoleon. In the spring of 1808, under the pretext of guarding Spain against the British, French troops took up strategic positions across Spain. The Spanish people saw the presence of French troops as the latest in a long line of humiliations and held Chief Minister Godoy responsible. There were riots at the Palace of Aranjuez, and Godoy was nearly lynched. Napoleon invited the Spanish royal family and Godoy to take refuge in the French city of Bayonne and sent Marshal Murat with 50,000 troops to restore order in Madrid. But on the 2nd of May, 1808, the people of Madrid rose up against Murat's soldiers. It became known as the Dos de Mayo Uprising, immortalized by the artist Francisco Goya. This scene shows the Mamelukes of Napoleon's Imperial Guard being attacked by the citizens of Madrid. 100 soldiers were killed. The French responded ruthlessly, firing on crowds in the streets and executing hundreds by firing squad. Meanwhile, in Bayonne, Napoleon forced King Carlos to abdicate and bestowed the title King of Spain on his own brother, Joseph. Who are your enemies? Napoleon, Emperor of the French. Where does Napoleon come from? From evil. Spanish Catechism. That summer, as Napoleon forced a modern new constitution on Spain and his brother Joseph entered Madrid as its new king, the Spanish people reacted with fury. The French had arrogantly trampled on their national honor. They were also godless atheists, who during the French Revolution had rejected the Pope and the Catholic Church. Napoleon, priests warned the peasantry, was the Antichrist. Uprisings erupted across the country. The Spanish army was joined by militias and partisans who attacked French troops and killed collaborators. The French took brutal reprisals. There was no mercy. The countless atrocities horrified Francisco Goya and led to his famous Disasters of War series. At first, it seemed the French would easily crush the revolts. Girona, Valencia, and Zaragoza were besieged by French armies, while the Spanish army of Galicia was defeated by Marshal Bessières at the Battle of Medina del Rio Seco. But 8 days later, General Dupont and 3 French divisions were withdrawing from Córdoba, slowed by wagons laden with loot, when they were surrounded at Bailén by General Castaños's army of Andalusia and forced to surrender. The Spanish took 18,000 French prisoners, about half of whom later died of starvation. Bailén was a humiliation for France. It was the first major defeat of the French army since Napoleon had become emperor. France's enemies across Europe rejoiced. Napoleon was furious. The situation went from bad to worse. The Portuguese joined the revolt, while fierce Spanish resistance forced the French to raise their sieges of Valencia, Girona, and Zaragoza. The new king of Spain, Joseph Bonaparte, was even forced to flee his capital. The British assisted the revolt, which the Spanish now called their War of Independence, by shipping arms to Spain via the Royal Navy. On the 1st of August, a small British army commanded by Sir Arthur Wellesley landed in Portugal to support their uprising. On the 17th of August, he beat a small French force at Roliça. Then 4 days later, defeated Junot's main force at the Battle of Vimeiro. But Wellesley's newly arrived superior, Sir Hugh Dalrymple, then agreed to repatriate Junot and his army to France, with all their arms and looted wealth, using British ships. In Britain, the generous terms were seen as a disgrace and a scandal. A subsequent inquiry exasperated Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. But Dalrymple never held command again. Everywhere that I am not, they do nothing but stupid things. Napoleon, on hearing news of Bailén. Napoleon decided the only way to sort out the situation in Spain was to go there himself. He assembled 130,000 reinforcements, including many of his best troops, and on the 7th of November led a second invasion of Spain. Most Spanish soldiers were inexperienced, often poorly equipped and badly led, and their armies had no coherent strategy. They were no match for the Grande Armée, which swept across the river Ebro and inflicted heavy defeats on the Spanish at Burgos and Tudela. At Tudela, Marshal Lannes's Third Corps avenged the defeat at Bailén by routing the army of General Castaños, sending it fleeing in 2 directions. Napoleon was in swift pursuit. North of Madrid, 8,000 Spanish troops held the mountain pass at Somosierra. Napoleon, impatient to get to the capital, ordered his Polish Guard lancers to charge. In a brave, almost suicidal attack, they charged straight into the mouths of the Spanish guns and cleared a path for the French army. 4 days later, after Napoleon threatened to obliterate the city, Madrid opened its gates to his army. Unaware of the disaster that had engulfed the Spanish forces, a 20,000-strong British army, commanded by Sir John Moore, had just arrived in Salamanca after a 300-mile march from Lisbon, with another smaller force on its way from Coruña. The British army was inexperienced, but in stark contrast to the Spanish forces, it was well organized and led. When news reached Moore of the Spanish collapse, however, he planned to divert French forces by attacking Marshal Soult's isolated Second Corps and threatening Napoleon's communications to Burgos and France. At Sahagun, on the 21st of December, the 15th Hussars charged through the freezing winter night and routed a brigade of French cavalry at dawn, inflicting heavy losses. But as Moore prepared a full-scale attack on Soult's corps, he received news that Napoleon was advancing rapidly towards him with his main force from Madrid. "I am in pursuit, the sword at their kidneys." Napoleon, January 3, 1808. While 2 French corps under Marshal Lannes began the bloody second siege of Zaragoza, Napoleon saw his chance to trap the British army once and for all. Intent on trapping Moore between his own forces and Soult's Second Corps, he forced his men across the icy Guadarrama Pass in the middle of a blizzard. Moore, facing odds of more than 2 to 1, immediately ordered a retreat, planning a 250-mile march to the coast where his army could be evacuated by the Royal Navy. For both sides, the race to the sea was an exhausting ordeal. Through mountains, mud, and bitter cold, many fell by the wayside. British discipline collapsed, leading to looting and drunkenness, except in the rearguard, which fought a series of skillful delaying actions to hold off the French. The elite riflemen of the 95th Rifles distinguished themselves in these skirmishes. This light infantry regiment wore green uniforms for better concealment and was one of the few units on either side armed with rifles. Unlike standard muskets, rifles had spiral grooves in the barrel that spun the bullet as it was fired, making them slower to load, but much more accurate. In a legendary incident during Moore's retreat at Cacabelos, rifleman Tom Plunkett picked out and shot a French general at 400 yards, some say more. Thanks to the skill of the rearguard and the brutal pace of the retreat, the British stayed one step ahead of the French. On New Year's Eve, Napoleon received news from Paris, rumors of intrigue, and that Austria was mobilizing once more for war. The emperor left immediately for France, taking many of his best troops with him, and entrusted Marshal Soult and the Second Corps to complete the pursuit of the British. The chase continued, but on the 11th of January 1809, Moore's ragged army reached Coruña. For Sir John Moore's exhausted army, the Spanish port offered food, supplies, and the prospect of rescue. But only a few ships were there to meet them on the 11th. Fortunately, the British had been able to blow up the bridges behind them to delay Marshal Soult's advance. And 3 days later, on the 14th, the naval transports arrived, allowing Moore to begin embarking his cavalry and artillery. But the very next day, Soult's army appeared on the hills south of Coruña, taking up high positions on the Peñasquito Heights, where he sighted his main gun battery. Half of Moore's army was deployed in a defensive line 2 miles south of the town, with 2 divisions held back to protect the right flank. Both armies numbered around 16,000. The French had 4 regiments of dragoons, while the British cavalry was already aboard ship. But the broken terrain of walls, hedges, and olive trees made the battlefield unsuitable for cavalry. Soult's plan was to attack the British right flank and trap Moore's army against the sea. Around 2 p.m., the French artillery opened fire. Then, Mermed's infantry division advanced, supported by La Houssaye's dragoons on the left. Moore had been unsure when Soult would attack and had just ordered Paget's division to begin embarking. Now he hastily canceled that order. Paget would instead bring his men up to strengthen his exposed flank, and Fraser's division would take up a high position on the Santa Margarita Heights. The French pushed through the hedges and walls, amid heavy skirmishing from both sides. Then the British counterattacked. The 42nd Highlanders and 51st Foot charged into the village of Elvina and drove the French out. But in the confused fighting, they were in turn soon driven back to their own lines. Sir John Moore was close to the front line, observing events, urging on officers and men. But as he ordered the Guard Brigade to reinforce the line, he was struck in the shoulder by a cannonball. He remained conscious, but it was clearly a mortal wound, and he was carried back to the town. Soult sent Merle's division to support the attack on Elvina. The Scottish general, Sir John Hope, had taken over command of the British army from the dying Moore, and he ordered 2 infantry battalions forward to meet the French attack. Now Paget's division, spearheaded by the 95th Rifles, arrived to reinforce the British right. The ground was so bad for horses that the French dragoons were forced to dismount and fight on foot, but were slowly driven back by the British. Paget's attack threatened the flank of Mermet's advance on Elvina, and he too was forced to fall back. Meanwhile, an attack on the right by Delaborde's infantry division aimed to secure a position in the village of Piedralonga, but was bogged down with heavy casualties. Around 6 p.m., darkness fell, and the firing died down across the battlefield. News that the British had held their ground briefly sustained Moore before he died in Coruña around 8 p.m. That night, the British lit campfires and posted sentries, then silently withdrew to Coruña to begin their embarkation. The next morning, the French found the enemy positions abandoned, but they were slow to take advantage. It wasn't until midday that they were able to bring up 6 cannon and sight them overlooking the Coruña Bay. The British had almost completed their embarkation when the French cannon opened fire. In the hasty escape, a few British transport ships ran aground, and 2 were set ablaze, but losses overall were light. A small Spanish garrison in Coruña waited until the British fleet had escaped to sea before surrendering. I hope the people of England will be satisfied. I hope my country will do me justice. Sir John Moore's last words. Whether Moore's retreat to Coruña was a British disaster or a miraculous escape is still debated, as is whether he abandoned Spain in its hour of need or drew off Napoleon's main force, buying time for his allies. Either way, Britain's only army had been saved and would return to fight another day. While Napoleon now faced the prospect of a long war on the Iberian Peninsula and a renewed conflict with Austria, a war on 2 fronts that would challenge his empire like never before. Napoleon had blundered in Spain, but it would be a year before the scale of his error was clear. He later said, "I embarked on this affair very badly, I admit it. The immorality of it was too patent, the injustice too cynical, and the whole thing remains very ugly. To be continued."